All right, so really excited to have our next speaker back again. And wow, if I told you all the things that Jenna does, it'd probably take up the whole time that we have. But Jenna is a global consultant for self-directed education, is working on a new book, and maybe she'll tell us a little bit about that as she's going on, which we can't wait for. Has been published in many different journals, is the founder of Riverstone Village, which is a Sudbury-inspired self-directed learning community.
So this is a part 2 on the presentation that I did last time. And in fact, I'm going to quickly just try and get you the link to my YouTube channel where you can catch up on that one, because some of the things that I speak about today, you might have questions that I can't answer quickly because it's going to have to do with content from that previous talk. Here in the chat will be the link to my channel with SDE theory. And when I mention those videos, you'll know where you can go and bookmark them to have a look when you've finished recovering from the incredible richness of this weekend. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the cycle of competence. Great. Okay. So the cycle of competence is a model created by a management trainer, Martin Broadwell, in the same year that I was born, 1969, which is when Sudbury Valley School had just been open 1 year. It was a little toddler. And this model he created to explain something about how humans learn. And it's still very pertinent and very useful today. So first of all, I'm going to just explain how the basic model works. Some of you might already be familiar with it. But what I'm really here to do today is to talk about 2 insights that I've had during the last few years of my experience with self-directed education. And the first of those is that in SDE, this cycle can actually run backwards, which is something I haven't seen written about anywhere else. And then the second insight I've had is that a lot of things can happen between stage 2 and stage 3. And that as facilitators, as educational assistants, there's a lot that we can do to make a difference around what happens when people move from stage 2 to stage 3. So those are the 2 insights that I'm going to be looking at today. And the first one I'm going to talk about after I first introduce you to the basic cycle so that we all know where we are. Very briefly, we all start out not knowing that there is something to know. If I've never heard of astrophysics or coding or geography or the Basque language, I'm unconsciously incompetent. I don't know that I don't know. And ironically, when we're in that stage, we also might think that we know when we don't. From there, we move to stage 2, which is conscious incompetence, which is where I realize that there's something that I don't know. And I'm aware of the gap in my knowledge, skills, or abilities. From there, I can move to conscious competence, where I now know that I know, and I'm able to do things, but in a very deliberate way. And from there, if I work at it, and I have the basic talents necessary, I can achieve a stage of unconscious competence, where I've actually mastered it to the point that I don't really know that I know, and I can do it by habit without thought. So for example, I might think that I'll know how to drive the second I get into a car, but I've never driven before. That's the stage of unconscious incompetence. It looks so easy. Then I would get in and have a go and stall the car, or hopefully not crash it into a wall, the way that happened when I first tried to teach somebody to drive and thought I could be a driving teacher because I was unconsciously incompetent about that and crashed my car into a wall. And when you get the feedback from that stage that you don't know, then you can start that learning journey into learning how to drive, and you get your learner driver there in the yellow at stage 3. Who has to really focus so that they don't stall on a hill start and really watch out for stop signs, remember where the indicator is. But by the time we pass our driving test, we have to have entered at least the beginning of level 4, where we're just driving, we're not thinking anymore about when to press the accelerator and where to find the brake. So that's a very, very quick once around. I'm now going to go through it in a bit more detail to make sure that we get the level of detail we need in order to look at what happens in the other 2 scenarios that I'm going to address tonight. So we always start from the same place of unconscious incompetence. And as I said, ironically, we often think that we do know. A classic example of this is also when people first learn to play the guitar. I don't know if you've ever tried to play the guitar or know anybody who has, but the usual experience is you learn your D, you learn your E, you learn your G or your A, and then you are Eric Clapton, and you know you are brilliant. Not yet able to actually assess how far there is to go. So your competence is so small that it's really incompetence. Then you are going to have to move on to realizing that there's more to learn, which we'll go through in a minute. Another lovely story about this first stage, stage 1 in the red, is about the Zen master trying to explain to the young Zen monk how to meditate effectively. And the monk is always saying, yes, yes, I know exactly what you mean. So the Zen master just quietly smiles and starts pouring tea into the young monk's cup until the young monk says, stop, stop, it's overflowing, nothing more can fit. And the master says, yes, exactly. You are so full of your beliefs and your opinions that you have to empty your cup before you will be able to hear what I am saying. Now, that move from thinking that we know to emptying our cup so that we can find out is a move that we need to take. And interestingly, this also applies to our own knowledge about education. In a world where mainstream coercive school is what we see, it's very easy to think that we all know what education is and how it works, and that there's nothing further to explore because it's already sorted. So we have to have some kind of experience that wakes us up to the fact that there is something more to find out that we don't yet know. And again, we can enter this stage when that happens. So another thing that we often see is people saying, oh yes, I know exactly what self-directed education is. I completely get it. And in their next sentence prove that they have completely misunderstood and they don't really yet grasp what it is all about. So this is a stage that sometimes people persuade us, challenge our point of view, or sometimes our direct experience begins to wake us up. You may have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is when we don't know about something to be able to assess our own competence, we often overestimate our competence, precisely because we just don't know enough about the thing in order to be able to assess accurately. And for this reason, we can also sometimes find it very difficult to tell the difference between ourselves and an expert, because we don't know what we are looking at. And this can lead us to think we are experts when we're actually beginners. So especially when we look at an expert and see them doing something with such ease. If I watch Jerry playing ping pong, it looks easy, okay? But then I get the feeling, oh, that's easy. I could beat him. I could take him any time. I could easily do the same or better. But when I get to actually doing it, I get my hide whipped. There's a beautiful story there about the novelist Terry Pratchett. I don't know if any of you have read the Discworld series, but he's a really, well, was really an amazing master. And the story goes that he was at a party having a chat with a brain surgeon. And at some point, the brain surgeon said, oh yeah, you're a novelist. I'm going to be a novelist when I retire. And Sir Terry, being the man he is, simply responded, and I'm going to be a brain surgeon when I retire. Then once we've had that wake up, we move to stage 2. We realize that we don't know and that we are not competent. And this is a necessary stage before learning can really begin, because without that aha, there's no incentive to make the effort required to learn. When I toss a lump of clay onto a spinning pottery wheel and I stick my hands into it just like I saw the potter do, but instead of whirling up into a beautiful bowl, it splatters all over the place or collapses into a mess, then I can see the point of paying the potter to teach me. When I perform my 2-chord song for an audience and they kindly, politely clap instead of screaming and fainting like they do at a Clapton concert, I might see the point of learning a few more chords and working on my strumming technique. Once I get past that stage and move into stage 3, after a while of working and learning, if I stick at it, I can get to the point of genuine competence. I can play that full set of songs that my friends can actually sing along with, or I can throw a pot that I could use as a fruit bowl. At this stage, though, I still do have to focus and do things deliberately, and I now know enough to know that I know what I'm doing, but I'm not an expert. And at this point, I can see that I'm not at stage 4. I'm not anywhere near being the next Clapton, and there's no point me trying to make a perfect set of matching porcelain dinnerware yet. So at this point, I might start looking for mentors, courses. I'd start taking inspiration from masters. And if I have enough of the basic inborn aptitude and enough resources to let me practice, and maybe also some access to a coach or a good role model, then I might or I might not reach stage 4. At the stage 4, if I get there, my abilities have become automated. I can perform to a level of excellence without having to think deliberately about what I'm doing. I'm no longer counting the beats in my head when I focus on the steps of the dance. I'm no longer reminding myself to keep the clay moist enough. I'm no longer reminding myself to press that finger down harder on the fretboard so that the notes don't buzz when I go high. I can get into the flow and I can reach peak performance. Now, ironically, at this level, I can also lose sight of how much of an expert I actually am and make the mistake of thinking that other people know more than they actually know, just because my own knowledge feels so natural, which can sometimes make it hard for the expert to teach beginners, because they can struggle to understand that beginners haven't mastered the steps that by now seem so obvious to me. I remember my own grandmother, right into her 80s, talking about her trauma with her maths teacher in high school, because this woman's stock phrase when they were struggling with the advanced mathematical concepts was simply, "But girls, it's so simple." And this is the mechanism behind Daniel Greenberg's insights into the power of peer-to-peer learning support. That very often it's people who know just a little bit more than I do who are the best equipped to guide me, rather than an expert who can't relate to the details of my struggle. So that's a look at the basic cycle of competence as it's commonly understood. And now let's move on to 2 new insights. So the first insight is that this cycle can run backwards once self-directed education enters the picture. Briefly, we can start at unconscious incompetence. And then without realizing it, through play, we can actually learn something. When I'll talk about intrinsic structure in a moment, but intrinsic structure of learning can lead directly to competence, which is followed only later with conscious awareness, because I become unconsciously competent in that I don't even realize that I know, and I actually can think that I don't know or I can't do something. But then something happens to make me realize that actually now I can, or I do know. And that can take me there into the conscious competent part there, where I realize, oh, I actually can do this thing, or I actually do know this thing. And from there, I can realize that there are gaps in my knowledge, that I might not be all the way there with this particular skill. And that can take me to the orange conscious incompetence, where I realize that as much as I do know, there's also things I don't know, and I can actually go round and round in that little area there for a while before moving back up through the yellow to the green of a higher level of unconscious mastery. So what do I mean by intrinsic structure, and how does this reverse cycle actually work? So this is one of those places where I won't be able to go through all of this information again. This was last time's talk, but very briefly, there are several forms of structure to our learning. What we're most aware of in our society at this point in history is this gray area at the top, which is imposed structure, which is where other people bring a structure like a curriculum, for example, or a set of courses or a lesson, and it's imposed on us. And you'll see that that arrow leads down towards other learning structures which it tries to engage, because the lower learning structures are actually what makes that learning stick. However, if we go all the way down past imported structure, adopted structure, co-created structure, self-generated structure, and emergent structure, eventually we reach the deepest structure, which is the heart and soul of self-directed education, which is intrinsic structure. And there the arrow will go up through all of the others. So again, just as this goes in two completely different directions, so with the cycle of competence. So now I do need to review what intrinsic structure is. Otherwise, those who missed that talk are not going to be able to follow, but I encourage you to use that link to my channel sometime to go and catch up if you're curious about the rest of these. So what I call intrinsic structure is one of the key differentiators of SDE, in that SDE, self-directed education, is pretty much the only approach to education that I've come across that recognizes the importance of intrinsic structure. And as such, it's critically important for an SDE facilitator to understand and value this type of learning and acknowledge that it's a valid way to learn. I believe that Daniel Greenberg repeatedly writes about this, and Sudbury Valley School vigorously defends it. And on the other hand, no non-SDE approach to education that I've encountered gives it any airtime at all. It's usually considered distraction. Reading Greenberg, you'll see what I'm calling intrinsic structure referred to, not by that name, but in terms of things like the discipline that he points out that even tiny babies use when building their own personal models of reality. The rules that he tells us are hidden within even the simplest forms of solitary play. Intrinsic structure is the reason that SDE facilitators are careful about interrupting students even when they seem to not be busy, and why boredom is valued rather than avoided in Sudbury style education. So what I mean by the deep intrinsic structure is the internal, pretty much invisible structuring that is directed by our intuitive self. We are not generally conscious of our own intrinsic learning structures. When we're just messing about with no particular aim in mind, like Christopher Robin wandering through the 100 Acres Wood, and we end up having a profound insight or learning experience or inspiration, that's not chance. It's a result of a complex but invisible structure of the experience by our deep unconscious intuitive self. And this is what Carl Rogers calls our self-actualizing tendency. We grow. It helps us learn our first language. It urges us to experiment. It directs our very individual sense of curiosity. It guides us into meaningful interactions, gives us aversions to activities we're not ready for, fills us with longing for adventure, sends us into midlife crises, and more. And in terms of the drives identified by Peter Gray, intrinsic structure relates to the educative drive of curiosity. This is what makes us obsess and focus on a learning activity and switches off that obsession once we've had our fill. It decides how long we're going to digest something and how long we will incubate before our next creation or exploration. These learning experiences feel very natural and automatic. And from the outside, our activities might seem unfocused or without purpose. I love to give the example of my son when he was 5 or 6, throwing dust into the wind. He could do this for absolute hours. Now, most other forms of education would see that as a waste of constructive time at an age when he should have been learning to read, but it actually helped him to develop an incredible sense of aerodynamics and intuitive physics. So respect for this level of self-direction is core and necessary to SDE for it to be SDE. And without respect for this level of self-direction, SDE isn't really the same thing that Greenberg, Gray, and the rest of us are writing about. The facilitator who has an intuitive respect for this kind of learning is likely to be effective as a facilitator, even if they can't explain anything about SDE at all. They'll be able to support people in it. The rest of us, myself very much included, needed to go through a process of learning to trust intrinsic structure. And that's a lot of what deschooling is all about. For as long as we harbor a suspicion of intrinsic structure, our facilitation will be more suited to progressive education than to self-directed education. Now I'd like to give you a bit of an illustration using one of my other favorite topics. Let's have a look at a youngster learning to read as an illustration of intrinsic structure. Of course, most of us know how it happens using the Gray imposed structure, in that somebody would sit the youngster down, tell them, now we're going to teach you to read. This is A, this is B. B makes the sound B, however they're going to do it. How would they do it with intrinsic structure? So this would be guided by the young person's developmental readiness, by social cues, and by general life context. That would inspire a desire to understand the sounds that go with symbols. They would start becoming aware that symbols make sounds. The intuitive self comes up with a series of strategies to master this learning area, which can take a form that's completely personalized and different from child to child. For example, they might start paying attention to symbols and noticing that many of the symbols correlate with particular sounds. Or they might start wondering about the sounds of all symbols noticed. There's rules in here that include pay attention to symbols and listen out to discover what they stand for. Or they might unconsciously notice that mommy always says the same word when there's the same little pattern on the page of the bedtime storybook. In this case, the rules would include listening to the words, noticing the patterns, and unconsciously collecting those correlations. The young person is often not even conscious of the structure. They're not trying to do something on purpose at this stage. That's what happens at the emergent and self-generated stages. They can do this staying purely in the intrinsic level, where it's just something that's happening. You usually can't see this happening from the outside, and it's not what most educators would think of as structure at all. But it's a core part of learning in SDE, and a focus on consciously planned learning can actually interfere with the operation of this kind of structure by wiping it out of the way. Deschooling, if children have been to school, is often the process of allowing people to heal out the damage done and the interference that's come in so that they can reconnect with their intrinsic structure and strengthen this kind of deep self-direction. Now, all of us learn things this way all our lives. It never goes away. Even once we recognize that, it can be hard for our minds, if we've been schooled, to accept that this is an effective way of learning things like reading or maths. And people who are new to SDE are sometimes very skeptical when old hand facilitators say that with some young people, you never even know how they learned to read. It just seemed to happen and nobody could track it. Sometimes even the young people themselves appear to be trying to create explanations for how they learned rather than really knowing how they did it. And that's what it looks like when people learn from the intuitive self using intrinsic structure. So now that we know what we're talking about, let's go back to that reverse slide. So when it goes forwards, briefly to recap, we start unaware of our own ignorance. We don't know that we know. Then we realize we're ignorant. We know that we don't know. From there, we acquire skills and knowledge until we're conscious of our learning achievement. And finally, we integrate our learning to the point where it becomes part of us and we can do it by habit. But in cases where learning is directed by the intuitive self using purely intrinsic structure, we can go the other way, back to the reader. The young person starts out unaware that they cannot read. They may even think that they can read. For example, small children will often proudly read a book by reciting the series of words that intrinsic structure has helped them effortlessly memorize, but without being able to link individual words to symbols on the page. And if you flawlessly replace the printed words with other words, they wouldn't notice. They're unaware that they don't know. Then they may progress further without noticing that they are progressing and become able to recognize certain words in the written form. So many parents and facilitators tell anecdotes of children, for example, being able to select the right show in a YouTube drop-down search or printed TV catalog without being able to say how they're doing it, and while insisting that they cannot read. And young people can sometimes be very surprised when they suddenly realize they can read words like cat or zoo when they were quite convinced that they themselves couldn't read yet. And in this way, that unconscious incompetence can be directly followed by unconscious competence, and only when something happens become conscious competence, when they discover that they have learned some words, which then can take them to the orange of realizing that they don't know all the words. So the whole cycle runs backwards. You don't know that you don't know, then you learn without knowing and not even realizing that you now know, until something happens to make us aware that we know, which makes us aware that there's some parts we do know and some that we don't. I personally learned a lot about parenting and self-directed education facilitation like that. And it'd be interesting to hear maybe later in the questions section, or if you want to put it in the comments, if you can think of anything that you've learned that way around. It's easy to see this with toddlers, for example, who don't consciously think about trying to walk, but end up walking in order to push a wagon or a stroller. Then they get distracted by something and let go of the stroller for a few steps. And then when they suddenly notice that they've let go of the stroller, they immediately fall, thinking that they can't yet walk. And many of us experience a simple version of this with popular music. We pick up the lyrics of a song we've heard in the background, maybe even if we don't like it, and we can be surprised to discover how far we can sing along if we're asked to do so, at which point we also identify which lines we don't have down yet. So that's the first thing I noticed about self-directed education and the cycle of competence. That one's kind of interesting, and the moral of the story is there's a lot to be said for acknowledging intrinsic structure and letting people learn in natural ways. The second thing I noticed is maybe even more important and has maybe even more impact. Looking at this usual way of looking at the cycle, it looks as if, it's presented as if we automatically go around. But when we think about it, it is not so. We all start at the red, and we may or may not move to the orange, depending on what life experiences we have. But there's actually no guarantee that we're going to go from orange to yellow. It doesn't work that way. For example, I know that I don't know what my motor mechanic knows, but I'm not going to go off and study how to fix my own car. I know that my doctor knows more about my body than I do, but I am not going to go and study medicine. So sometimes we move on to that third stage, and sometimes we don't. And what I want to look at here is take a closer look at what makes that difference, because some of those factors are obvious, while others really bear closer examination. So there's two very different things that can happen at stage 2 with vastly different impacts on progress or not to stage 3. And I call that two different things that can happen: curiosity versus shame. When we go into a stage of curiosity, we are more likely to move to stage 3. If shame is triggered, we can actually go in a very crippled way into stage 3, where we won't actually master the skills, or we can even be prevented from going to stage 3. What influences that? So two of the things that are obviously going to make a difference to whether I go on to stage 3 and learn. The first would be access to resources. So obviously, if I can't get to med school, I can't become a doctor. If I can't get my hands on a guitar more often than once a month, there's not a lot of chance I'm going to become proficient. However, access is also mediated by motivation. Now, here's another talk that you can go and have a look at on my channel that I did at AERO before. I can't really now right here go into intrinsic and extrinsic and controlled and autonomous motivation, but it's really worth unpacking. For now, we're going to pretend that we can just talk about motivation that is high and motivation that is low. So if we have a look at this little picture here, if motivation is low and access is low, then we're obviously not really going to go anywhere. I've got no desire to learn the guitar and there's no guitar around. I'm not going to learn to play the guitar. Full stop, end of story. If I've got a kind of a medium level of motivation, but I don't have any access to a guitar, it's like, yeah, I'd like to learn guitar, but you know, there isn't one around. I'm very unlikely to learn how to play the guitar. If I've got a medium of both, so yeah, I'm interested in guitar and hey, you know, my friend's got one and I go around there twice a week. It's possible I might learn how to play the guitar. If I've got high motivation, I want to learn to play the guitar, but I have no access to a guitar, it's still not going to happen. If I've got high access to a guitar, there's one sitting in my room, but my motivation is low, it's still not going to happen. If both are high, I've got a guitar sitting there in my room and I want to play it, very likely I'm going to learn. And again, if my access and motivation are very high, it's then very likely that I'm going to learn. So a few examples. Just on the guitar thing, I actually know a young person who was given a miniature sized guitar at the age of 4, and I think unzipped that case twice in about 10 years before giving it away. And for myself, I was encouraged to do my philosophy honors. I was guaranteed a place, but I chose psychology instead because I'd kind of exhausted the ceiling of the philosophy department in that particular institution. Sometimes, let's just detour for a second, sometimes motivation can actually go in the opposite direction, which we'll come back to in a moment when we have a look again at shame, in that an aversion can be created, which can take us right out of this picture over here to the bottom corner. So for myself, for example, I got a scholarship to do my psychology master's, but I looked at the job options on the other side of that master's. And at that point in my life, none of them were in the human potential area. They were all deficit oriented and about fixing people, which really turned my stomach. So although I had very, very high access, I didn't do it. I actually had an aversion, which took me right out of here, and there was just no chance I was going to do it. You couldn't have paid me to do it. Then let's have a look at when the motivation is medium. The same young person who never unzipped the guitar more than twice in 10 years actually did go and learn the trumpet for a full year because their motivation was higher and access was medium. But when the access became low, because the family moved a little bit further away and the car trip became unpleasantly long, they dropped the trumpet because the motivation wasn't high enough to overcome the drop in level of access. And for myself, when I didn't go on to do my psychology master's, I quite enjoyed singing and songwriting, and my friend invited me to join a band. So I went into the music industry because it pretty much landed in my lap, and that was fun for a while. But after a while, I came back to wanting to learn about learning and growth and how humans tick. If motivation is high, access might not remain an obstacle for long. So even if you've got very low access, but you've got high motivation, you can make it happen. So an example we've seen at Riverstone Village is a young person who really wanted to do metalwork forging, but we didn't have anything to do that with, not so much as a decent hammer, never mind a forge, never mind a bellows. But his motivation was high, so he started planning and he started fundraising. And for myself, after I discovered the whole human potential movement and alternative education, there was no way within conventional institutions in my city to study that kind of psychology and learning theory. So I found other self-directed ways to learn. And then, of course, if motivation is high enough, lack of access itself can actually start motivating invention and discovery. It's actually a very good combination, very high motivation, very low access. So this is what drives creativity, science, and philosophy, arts, everything creative. So that young person who had the high motivation for the forge had very low access, had to even hand make a leather apron, figured out how to actually build a bellows from scrap. And I was so determined to learn how to facilitate self-directed education, but geographically, I couldn't get anywhere near a Sudbury school to learn and intern the normal way. So I ended up creating my own facilitation courses. So this is a combination that influences whether we move to stage 3, but it's very, very strongly impacted by our experience at stage 2. No matter what our access is, if our motivation isn't high enough, we're not going to go to stage 3. And if our experience at stage 2 is problematic, that's going to impact our motivation. If our experience at stage 2 is positive, that's going to positively impact our motivation. So, something that happens in mainstream coercive education is sensing that the second stage is tricky, they try to rush us past it. It's kind of a dangerous thing for kids to sit in their awareness of their incompetence. So the usual way to deal with this is to actually introduce learning materials before there's even an awareness of any incompetence, so that they try to completely bypass this stage 2 in the orange. For example, children are generally taught their times tables before they've even started thinking about how to improve their capacity to multiply things. Subjects are introduced like, I've never heard of World War II when the teacher starts telling me about it. My curiosity hasn't even begun. I'm not even aware that there's anything to learn. So the lessons come in cold, and that prevents me from going through this process at stage 2. Now, the impact of that is that it can really impact motivation and curiosity, because curiosity takes time to build up. It's a kind of hunger. That's why it's called a spoiler when people tell you what's going to happen in the story or the movie. If you think about it, if you know everything that's going to happen, it can actually spoil your experience of watching, because that curiosity is what's driving your desire to learn what happens next. And if you already know, then you have to have other reasons to be there. And this is also why movie companies get actors to sign non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, that you're not allowed to tell the public what your character does or what's going to happen next, because that's going to drop your ratings, drop your audience numbers. So curiosity takes time to build. And if we're going to come straight in with a lesson before any curiosity is actually built up, the chances are that the person is going to enter towards stage 3 in a state of very low motivation, which can sabotage their learning. So rushing stage 2 means we often move forward while curiosity and motivation are still low. So why? Why do we do this? Well, we do this because if there is coercion and pressure at stage 2, we can go into a state of shame. Shame, Brené Brown has a lovely definition. She says it's an intensely painful feeling of experiencing or believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. My own working definition is that when there is pressure from outside or within to achieve something that we cannot do, that leads to a feeling of shame. I should have done better. I must do better. But it was or is impossible for me. But that's not accepted. It's not acceptable. So there's no escape from this negative loop. And it generates this horrific, toxic, creepy, crushing feeling of self-hate that has components of regret, dishonor, despair, helplessness. I'm not good enough. I need to hide, feel safe, escape the pressure. I wish I could disappear or die. Now, this is where young people often have these horror stories, which unfortunately get treated with a kind of a humorous, oh yeah, that's just school kind of attitude by society. But there's just so many stories of this enormous humiliation and shame that happens in classrooms when kids are pressured to achieve something that they're not ready, not capable of at that point in their development. And this is why I believe why conventional coercive education tries to bypass this stage. Because the moment that you've got that coercion and pressure and prescription, the result of sitting in stage 2 is going to be shame. And what happens when that happens? So when we try to escape that feeling of shame, there's a number of ways we go about doing this. And you'll see this rife in your conventional coercive school. Cheating to create the impression that I know more than I do. Denial that it's worth learning, retreat into sour grapes. I couldn't care about maths. Who needs that? Despair, anxiety, as Peter Gray's studies show, it's going through the roof. Depression, likewise. I'm not good enough. People giving up on themselves, assuming that they won't manage. I'm stupid. Avoiding things that I might fail at. So I start selecting only the things that I'm already good at and lose out on the opportunity to strengthen some of my weaknesses. Avoidance behaviors like acting up and acting out, and the whole range of fight, flight, freeze reactions. So a little more detail there. For example, defiance, clowning around, bullying others, rebellious behaviors, smoking, substance abuse, ODD. And then in the flight area, anxiety, truancy, zoning out, daydreaming, inability to pay attention or focus, retreat into addictive gaming or substance abuse, freeze, chronic fatigue, illness, depression, and ultimately suicide. Let's notice how rife these are in the mainstream coercive system. By amping up the pressure, coercive education teaches us to be ashamed when we don't manage what we're told to manage, whether it's bladder control, being able to sit still for 6 hours, or pass an exam. And this shame is powerful enough to create that aversive motivation that leads students to try to avoid certain academic activities. And from that stage of aversive motivation, but they have no way to avoid the learning pressure because they're being forced to stay present, that can be extremely stressful, which is where you start finding a lot of those problematic behaviors and even, the severe depression and suicide. And obviously the medication that becomes necessary in order to be able to endure sitting in that tension of having to be where you cannot stand to be. Well, the lesson there is to look at what those pressures are. What are the pressures that cause shame? The moment that you've got prescription in the form of a curriculum that's being imposed, especially when it's being compounded by evaluation, competitive pressure, grading, tests, and high consequences for all of these things, you're essentially guaranteeing that anytime you let students sit there, they're going to go into shame. So what we need to do instead is when we are in that shift from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, we need to be gentle and kind to ourselves and others. We need to move, instead of shame, we need to move into a beautiful old-fashioned word that's vastly underused these days, which is humility. Humility is when we can admit that we can't yet manage and we don't yet know, and that's okay. It's very, very different to shame. It's gentle. It's a calm feeling. It leaves us open to growth. And it's when we feel we have a sense of, well, I ought to know better, but there's no pressure. Either because people are supporting me or because I forgive myself, my limitations, regardless of what other people demand. This is a very important one for parenting because every parent struggles with this unconscious incompetence moving to conscious incompetence, and we need to forgive ourselves, love ourselves, and regardless of the demands from society or our children, just do the best that we can. This is also very necessary when becoming a facilitator. We need to be able to model for kids as well that it's okay to make mistakes and grow. And what we find is that people who've grown up with SDE, or who've just had more positive support, or whose experiences just didn't happen to be that traumatizing, or who are just extremely resilient people, don't have that shame reaction to becoming aware that they don't know. And often they don't even need to consciously access humility either, because there's just no ought at all. It just is as it is. Nobody knows everything. Everybody needs to start somewhere. Incompetence is just a natural first step on a journey we can choose to take or not. Wow, I've never had that thought, which opens the possibility of, tell me more. And that's when we move into curiosity. And this is where we want to be. Curiosity requires a sense of safety. Feelings of safety are almost inevitable when the cycle runs backwards, because a level of competence is already experienced before the awareness of incompetence comes in. So you know that you're already learning how to do it. So there's that reassurance by the time you realize you don't know everything. Safety thrives when there's no pressure. And one definition of zero pressure is play. So this is actually the natural reaction to realizing that there's something that we don't know and would like to know. If we look at people who have never experienced coercive education, never experienced shaming for not knowing, curiosity is there in our human spirit just waiting to emerge. And it's a delightful anticipation, a feeling of intrigue that moves us towards exploring, experimenting, finding out. Now, play and humor are two of the wonderful tools to help us shift ourselves when we find ourselves in shame or heading towards shame, and we want to move rather to curiosity and open the way to learning. My favorite anonymous saying is, "Blessed are we who can laugh at ourselves. We shall never cease to be amused." And that's what I find as an SDE facilitator we need to model, especially for the kids who are coming out of a history of coercive schooling and busy in their deschooling process. Play and curiosity are almost inseparable. This is also why play and learning are almost inseparable. And this is one of the biggest ahas of SDE. So, briefly, to look at how educational approach can affect experience at stage 2. When there is coercion, shame is almost guaranteed and is only prevented by the sheer luck of that individual being ready and capable of taking on the learning task that they're given. So that's where you find the few kids in the class who are actually ready for this knowledge and can master it won't go into shame. The rest are going to have some degree of shame at struggling with the task. When we use manipulation to try and scoot people past that stage or make it easier for them, or make them feel like, oh yeah, no, you're brilliant at this, you're grasping it, you'll get it. Shame can be reduced, but often at the expense of curiosity. Because again, we're spoon feeding and we're not actually allowing that self-direction to move that motivation up. When we can give support for self-direction, shame is still possible because of, firstly, social contexts. Kids pick up the fact that, hey, I'm 9 and I can't read yet, and the world says that's wrong. Other kids making comments, even just innocent reactions in a purely SDE environment. I can think of a 7-year-old who has a 10-year-old sibling who comments that, oh, well, I'm smarter than you because I can already read and you can't. Inept facilitators, which is why I offer SDE courses, so we can all get a leg up when we need to increase our competence. And yeah, I've got one starting right now. And yeah, so in SDE, when curiosity is supported, high motivation is supported, also through allowing flow, which is when people get into an activity, we don't interrupt them. We actually allow their intrinsic structuring to get to work and strengthen and drive them. which makes it a very, very satisfying, immersive process, which makes it very, very delightful to learn, which can also help to strengthen the curiosity and reduce the feeling of shame. So in SDE, there tends to be more of a balance towards curiosity and motivation. Also, in SDE, we don't exploit low motivation. So, for example, in other forms of education, when a child shows a flicker of interest in something, you're on it, you're taking them to the library, you're giving them assignments, you're reading to them about it, you bought them one. And that can actually, if you look at my other talk on motivation, that can actually hijack that little bud of motivation and crush it. And it can also exploit a little bit of motivation to get them busy with something that actually only has a low motivational level, rather than letting them get bored and drop it and move on to discover something for which they actually have higher motivation that they now don't get to, because we got them going on the thing that they showed a flicker of interest. So, some results. 3 visible results or impacts of the different shame versus curiosity levels in coercive versus self-directed education. This has been one of the biggest ahas for me in the last, what is it now, a year or so. First of all, dyslexia, which I call with a capital DYS, because from what I can see, dyslexia is a neurology, a talent profile that's there, but it certainly does seem that the reading problem doesn't develop in self-directed education. The reading problem only develops with pressure, coercion, and prescription. And in fact, dyslexics often seem to learn best to read when they learn in that backwards direction of actually creating their own learn to read process, rather than it being a top-down coercion that takes them into the shame cycles. Which is where also you'll see in SDE, while dyslexics might learn to read a lot later, they tend to retain the love of reading and become very fluent readers who enjoy it. Whereas even if reading difficulties are corrected through remediation, if there's coercion, pressure, prescription, you often shove the dyslexic along into stage 3 eventually, but they've got no hope in hell of ever getting to stage 4 because their motivation has been crushed, the aversion is there, the I'm not good enough is fixed as a sense of identity. Same thing with so-called dyscalculia comes to mind. I think there's a mum in this session who knows who I'm talking about here, definitely has dyscalculia, can't do maths, nothing helped, came into self-directed education, and after a bit of self-esteem healing, decided he wanted to try some maths and ended up passing his IGCSE maths last year very solidly, very confident, very pleased with himself, no dyscalculia at all. So that's the difference it can make. And then, of course, the third difference would be lifelong learning. Unfortunately, a coercive schooling situation often leads people to go, hooray, I've graduated. I don't have to study anything ever again. Whereas in SDE, we tend to see lifelong learners who really enjoy that next level of journey. So if you want to read more about the dyslexia journey that I've written up in What If School Creates Dyslexia, that's now available on Amazon, ebook on Smashwords as well. You can order it in French from Free Publishing, and all of those links that you need you can find. Don't have to write them down because you can just take my name, put .com, and you'll find everything you need there. And if you want to do some lifelong learning, my next course is on SDE for PDA. And if you don't know what PDA is, you maybe want to come and do some lifelong learning, because this is the neurotype that probably struggles the most out of everybody with coercive education. And learning to facilitate for PDA will take your SDE facilitation to a gold level standard. So to wrap up, let's focus on the positive. What can we do to build a culture that supports curiosity? The first thing that we can do, reduce pressure any way you can. Even if you've got a young person who's stuck in a conventional environment and struggling, you can take the pressure off. You can say, hey, doesn't matter. lots of people failed school, dropped out of school. You know, it's like, do your best. That's all you can do. Give them positive role models. I think of a girl I ran into a couple of years later when I became a mum. When she was at school, she was considered, you know, sort of one of the hopeless kids. And I found her because I was looking for maternity clothes, and she had started this incredible design and manufacture business in her garage, and she was absolutely thriving and loving it. And I can tell you she has a lot more business skills than I do. So reduce that pressure any way you can for a young person. Focus more on enabling motivation rather than spoon feeding access. So rather support a young person in discovering their own genuine motivation, rather than trying to move them along and make sure that they have the thing to follow the thing. Let the motivation build. Support them in getting what they need when they are driving it. So for example, in a Sudbury environment or a democratic schooling environment, this is often going to happen through meetings, democratic meeting, where kids can come and say, look, I want this to happen, I want us to get that. That there are actually visible structures, ways that they know they can go about empowering themselves, making their lives work. Even at a family level, you can make it clear that if you want to do something, this is how you go about making it happen, so that kids are not sitting in a learned helplessness, passiveness, waiting for the adults to actually supply everything, otherwise they can't do it. A perfect example there. I was in school at the age of 11 when we were going to have a science lesson about stripy toothpaste and how it was made. I was sick on the day of the lesson. It never occurred to me that I could go to the teacher and ask for a recap or look it up somewhere. I went for another 20 years not knowing how stripy toothpaste worked, until I suddenly realized one day that it was time I looked it up. Of course, creating a culture of play is the ultimate, because that not only reduces pressure, it also creates an environment where that cycle can work in reverse very, very easily. Unconditional positive regard. I will love you no matter what your marks are. I will love you whether you learn to read or not. You're a great person. You've got these great skills. In an SDE environment, we don't differentiate between your ability to do yo-yo tricks and your ability to do algebra. So it's very, very easy to get a sense of competence, because you can always play to your strengths, and that actually builds you up for tackling the things that you're more likely to struggle with. We need to create a space where it's safe to experiment, where we accept that failure is a very important part of learning. You can't learn without finding out what went wrong. This is the basis of science. We can emphasize that nobody is good at everything. Nobody is good at everything. Nobody. So finding out what is not for me is actually a good way to help me appreciate and prioritize my strengths by contrast, and also a great way to get collaboration and teamwork going. Support self-direction so that curiosity and motivation have time to build, and of course, kindness and empathy when people are frustrated, feeling shame, struggling, not good enough, depressed, anxious. Kindness and empathy. And last word, model. Be this. Blessed are we who can laugh at ourselves, for we shall never cease to be amused. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions and discussion.
All right, so before we start taking questions, we're going to have people just raise your hand, use the raise your hand function. But I do want to remind folks to look around the room. We have more than 60 people. So take up an nth of that time with your questions. So let's see what we have here for hands raised in the hand raised function. All right, Dilipa, then Barry. Go ahead, Dilipa.
I was thinking when Jana mentioned shame in SDE spaces, we use restorative practices when there has been some behavioral problems or conflict in order to sort of set things back. So when reading up on restorative practices in this book of restorative practices for schools, it talks about shame in a very different light. In fact, when I found it, it was so much a contradiction to me as well. So it refers to stigmatizing shame and reintegrative shame, where it says that often we tend to think of the word shame as something toxic, but in fact, biologically and psychologically, that it is viewed as shame is something that is actually useful to sort of set the compass right again. But as long as it's reintegrative shame. So it's like reintegrative shame is where you think of the action and not the person, and stigmatizing shame is where you think the person is bad because the action is bad. So I think I just reflected on the idea that Jana is talking about stigmatizing shame based on competency, lack of competency in something. And it's not the other version.
So what's
actually useful?
What's the question?
So I'd like to comment to that.
The question is that contradiction there. Yeah.
So I would actually, I would disagree with the person who says that shame is useful and can be positive. I would want to challenge them and check out with them if they can distinguish between shame and remorse. Because for me, what they would be calling their positive shame is what I would be calling remorse. I should have done better. I could have done better. I'm going to do better next time. Whereas shame happens when you cannot do better. I should have done better. I cannot do better. Now I'm stuck in a loop. So I would challenge that interpretation. Unfortunately, we're in an era where a lot of these linguistic subtleties are just being dropped by the wayside. I mean, the way people confuse jealousy and envy, just for example. So I would argue that that's the case there. I don't know if I'd be right, but I'd love to enter into that discussion and see whether I would change my mind. At the moment, I wouldn't.
Thank you.
All right, so Barry, remember, let's try to get to our questions quickly.
Thank you so much for your really heartfelt, meaningful talk. I really appreciate it. Just wanted to ask you, Alice Miller, the leading child psychologist, said emotion attaches meaning to experience. Without an emotion, nothing you talk about, read about, or write about makes any sense.
Yeah.
And Edward Bernays is called the father of American PR and advertising, who happened to be Sigmund Freud's American nephew, who picked up all of his ideas about how to manipulate the herd from his uncle Freud. So, as John Gatto said in Weapons of Mass Destruction, it literally says the main purpose of education is to make sure a child never learns to trust himself, and emotion is completely left out. So the top 1% behind the invisible curtain can flash powerful emotions that people will pick up and it will stay with them so that he can be manipulated and controlled completely. So what do you think about leaving emotion out so the top 1% have a weapon they can always use to manipulate and control the public? I mean,
well, I think that's happening right now, Barry. I think that's probably why we still have coercive education. And I think it's probably the only reason we still have it. And I think that when we get back to insisting that emotion comes first, we're no longer telling a child who's grieving the loss of a grandmother that she's got to do her spelling test, then we'll get to a world where we can get back to more of a collaborative way of living rather than having a 1% dictate and manipulate and profit off everyone else.
So believe it or not, the Nazis said they got their best ideas from Edward Bernays, and they wrote him fan letters.
I'm aware of Edward Bernays, and I think that he probably has a much bigger influence on education than people realize.
He has a total influence.
When I've gone looking for his writings, I find that, we kind of get to the point where he says, education should be a buffet of thoughts and ideas from which people must select so that it limits what they can choose from.
Absolutely.
And after that, we don't see any other easily accessible public writing. So I think that after that, it went pretty much in the back door. But I'm going to drop that question there now, and let's see who else would like to
bring something to the table.
Thank you.
Hartley, when you're ready, go ahead.
Great, thanks. Just making sure, you can hear me. in the context of your cycle of competence, is there anything that you think that we as educators should be aware of in terms of devices, cell phones and such, distracting learners away from this continuum?
So, this really depends on what your educational model is. I think when you are doing a combination of coercive, progressive, SDE or whatever, you're going to maybe find devices being a problem. If you're doing 100% SDE, we don't find that there's a problem. In fact, we find the opposite. What's emerged in my explorations of screen time is that when you limit kids' screen time, they tend to go for the stuff that's at the top, the stuff that's being pushed at them, the stuff that the marketers want them to pick up on, the stuff that their peers are saying is cool. And they don't get beyond that. So I find that the kids whose screen time is limited tend to get fixated on shooter games, the trashy YouTube kind of egomaniac stuff, your very, very commercial sort of franchised shows, whereas the unlimited kids tend to be able to exhaust that and get bored with it and actually drop down to the really interesting levels where, for example, I've seen kids sitting on opposite sides of the world or the city, virtual together in Google Maps, going to Street View and doing world tours and having a look at what it looks like in different countries. I've seen them use Roblox to create an educational tour for themselves where they actually used one game to pack their suitcases, another game to get on a plane journey. Then they used the Google Maps to decide where to go. Then they ended up looking at some of the history of the places that we're in. So that kind of next level, I think, our generation, I like to call us Homo sapiens, and I like to call the next generation Homo fidgetalis, because they're fidgetals. They actually don't distinguish between the physical and the digital the way that we do. Okay, for us, you're on a device or you're in real life. I've watched kids in a kitchen, and I actually turned to a guest who was on campus and I said, how many kids are in this room? And she said 4. And I said, no, 5. She said, where's the 5th? And I said, right there in that little phone that's on the counter, because she was present. They were talking with her. They were interacting with her. As far as they were concerned, she was completely in the room. As far as we were concerned, she was in a different city. So I think we are very, very prejudiced because we don't understand that way of thinking and we can't follow them there. But especially now with the pandemic, I think it's hugely important to realize that that device is not a device. It's actually a door. And if kids are not able to get out and go walk down the street, a la Peter Gray's utopia that I share, but it's just a utopia right now. If they can't go find kids in front of your door, they can go through a device and they can find kids. But they're not going to do that if you're limiting their screen time. So hope that helps.
So Derry, when you're ready, go ahead.
Yeah, look, Liza Loop has asked a question, but she hasn't put her hand up. So Liza, I hope you don't mind if I ask it for you, because it's such an interesting question. And Liza says, as a young child, I seemed to generate my own shame after watching my older brothers ride their bikes. I wanted to do that too, but couldn't. I created my own pressure. What do you suggest to kids like me, to their parents and teachers? Which I'll just add, so how do you deal with competition when you're in a family in the context of sibling rivalry?
Yeah, so I mean, that's where, as I said, pressure from within or from, without or from within. We do see this definitely. And I think that as facilitators, this is where the whole empathy thing comes in that if we are making enough time to be really present with young people, rather than just trying to shove knowledge at them or get them to do this or evaluate them, but we're actually relating to them on a human level and spending the time hanging out, letting it be relaxed. There's actually, firstly, time for us to notice this happening. There's secondly, time for them to build the safety with us, for them to express these struggles and frustrations. And that's really where the empathy comes in, not to try to solve it for them, but just to validate their feelings, validate their struggle, so that it can move a little bit maybe from being shame Because remember that shame has a sense of unworthiness, not good enough, undeserving of love. And the moment that you have somebody there who's giving you unconditional positive regard, and acknowledging what you're going through, and it's not that they don't realize that you're imperfect, they know you're imperfect, and they're still being there and giving you the time. You know, I've watched a number of young people move out of shame, move out of fear. I mean, just for example, the young man that I was talking about earlier, who went from, you know, thinking that he couldn't do maths to mastering his maths. You know, we didn't do any work with him on maths or his shame around maths at all. You know, we were just present with him and treated him like a human being, and, you know, the rest took care of itself. So I don't think it's a big obstacle when it's only internal. It can become, you know, more of a motivator to try and reach them, reach that level of competence. And that's where it's been beautiful. I've seen little kids going like, I can whistle. I can. And eventually they get there and they do. Yeah.
So I actually have a question. You were talking earlier about all the manifestations, you know, physical, psychological, emotional. And we were talking a little bit last night about trauma and limbic loops, and how trauma gets, you know, you get into this limbic loop and it keeps cycling. So I guess it's kind of sort of a two-part question. Do you think that SDE can do a lot to kind of unravel that and sort of create new neural pathways? And then have you come up against limitations to that?
So that's one of the sessions I'm hoping to catch on the recording. Yeah, I think SDE does a lot for that. Again, the body and the mind are very, very good at a kind of spontaneous healing. We're incredibly designed. You know, if you just nourish us and give us time, we heal. And I think SDE is very, very good at that. Limitations on that, you know, I think that where I have found it's difficult is when a child is still in the traumatizing environment, the moment that they leave our premises. That can be very difficult, because then they relax during the day and then they go back and tighten up. And, you know, that's hard. Yeah. And I think that's maybe one reason why Summerhill is a boarding school. And I think there's definitely a place for that. And I think we need more SDE boarding schools. Not every kid's going to need that. A lot of kids have got fantastic home environments, and half their learning is at home and half their role models are at home. So I don't agree with Neil that we need to extract every child from their family circumstances, but for some it really would help.
Okay. Jerry, I know you said you messaged me that you've been trying to put your hand up. So did you have a question?
You're talking to me?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, I just want to make a quick comment. I used to think that commencement a long time ago, I was younger, I used to think commencement meant the end.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, right. in the session last night, or for me last night, around looking at whether we can use the word slavery as, you know, to describe school, there was one example that is read as a mocking racist use of that, in terms of a white Mississippian graduate in his yearbook saying that it feels like, you know, he's just been freed from slavery. But the fact of the matter is, it might not be sick racist humor. It might actually be a very genuine expression of what he felt.
Dee, go ahead. You have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, and put this question in the chat, and I can understand if it's not the right forum, but I am interested, Jen, in your comments about midlife crisis. And like, do you see this as part of people coming to realize that they need to be self-directed, or, you know, after being conventionally schooled, or, and in a society that doesn't, yeah, just what's your take on the midlife crisis? Because I'm very interested in that.
Great. So my comment was that it's intrinsic structure that leads us into midlife crisis. So it's that deep unconscious part of ourselves that says to us, there's something I need to do. There's something I need to learn. There's something I haven't experienced. This life is not going to be complete. Time is running short. I think it's fantastic. I think the mistake people make sometimes in midlife crisis, I'm 52, so I think I'm qualified to speak. I've got enough friends around me going through it. It's a fantastic urge if you harness it. The mistake people often make is in sort of seeing it as a negative thing. And when they're not empowered, when people are not empowered and they try to fall back on what they've learned before, then they look for something outside themselves to create satisfaction. So they'll look for a lover, or they'll drop their career, or they'll want a new car, or whatever it is. Whereas really it's an opportunity to fall back into intrinsic motivation, intuitive drive, and find ourselves if we haven't done yet. It's pretty much our last chance, because to develop any real sense of competence, to make any really profound change, we need at least a decade, maybe 2. So, if you're feeling midlife crisis, woohoo, why don't you come to Riverstone Village, because we don't have an upper age limit for students.
Yeah, and right. I like just reflecting on it, like just people that I know who've had partners who've had this, like I feel like there's been such a deep shame that these partners have been completely incapable of communicating, and then the partner is left in the dark because they have no idea what's going on. So yeah, I'm just like, how do you help these people? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, in my experience, there's only one way to help somebody, and that is to just be present and give empathy and unconditional positive regard. It's the only thing. Anything else is going to be getting in their business, manipulating, not helpful. You can't guarantee that somebody does something positive with their opportunity, but you can just be present and give them love.
We got 3 more people whose hands are up in 8 minutes.
Yeah. So we have Sian, Renee, and Sydney. So go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Hey, Janae, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask quickly, and I don't know if it's too much to ask, but I'm wondering about helping kids who were in conventional school for the majority of their time, coming to high school or junior high, transitioning them to SDE. Do you have any courses even, or any advice like how I could support kids to bring them into that? Because they're so used to being spoon-fed, they don't even know how to handle that, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, that is a long answer. So the short answer to the long answer would be they need to go through a deschooling process, which means they need lots of freedom, lots of time, no pressure, lots of unconditional positive regard, preferably lots of resources, lots of access to peers. And yeah, that's why I run facilitation courses, and I'm delighted to see that more and more people are running facilitation courses. So sign up for somebody that appeals to you. Yeah, and Lainey Liberty does amazing stuff with helping teens find themselves. You might want to look at finding out if that teen would like to sign up with Lainey. She runs groups for self-directed teens.
Sorry, can you say the name again? I didn't catch it.
Lainey Liberty. If you look for World Schooling. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
All right, Renee, then Sydney.
Hi, Renee. Lovely to see you.
Anna, good to see you. Yes, it's been a few years, and of course it will be a little bit longer due to COVID.
Yeah.
And needing to develop its own variant, very special country, has its own variant, which is putting on hold my trip back. This was a wonderful presentation, so I wanted to thank you. I just really enjoyed listening to you present. My question to you is, since you and I spoke a couple of years ago, where is the South African government in terms of recognizing schools like Riverstone Village? Has anything shifted, or do you still register, I think, as homeschooling? You've gotten very creative as to how to do what you're doing in South Africa. Are there any updates?
So the only update would be that a couple of months ago, I sent an email to our department saying, so look, you guys have made it clear that your mandate is for education that is by curriculum and evaluation. That means we're outside of your mandate. That's very unfortunate. Let us know when you change your mandate, and then we'll be able to talk about working together. Until then, we fall under the Department of Social Development. And of course, we never received a response, but then, we felt we'd at least, put it on record. So that's the only update. At this point, I think they are just COVID collapsing and just trying to stay afloat. I feel really, really bad for them. They are having such a hard time.
And then my quick follow-up question then is, I was attending Jakob Hecht's presentation yesterday, and I was very inspired when he was talking about how he talks to people. He doesn't actually talk to government, he talks to people and finds the right people to connect with as just regular people. And I'm just wondering if you've tried that approach, and if so, how it's worked.
So I made one good connection at one point, but he's been moved. Things move a lot. I mean, he was a musician, with a lot of interest in creativity. Again, there's a lot of politics within the department to toe the official line. So it's very difficult, unless you reach somebody high enough up. And even then, we've got a situation where the head of sports and physical training cannot get the minister to grant more than 45 minutes per week, in spite of all of his lobbying. So to go from there to SDE is a really, really tall order. But yeah, look, I mean, I loved Jakob's presentation, and I definitely am going to give it some more thanks. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Sydney, and this is probably going to be our last question. So go ahead, Sydney.
Well, I'm always happy to end with Sid. Love Sid. Hello, Sid.
Hey, Jana. How are you, Jana? I'm glad to see you again.
Yeah.
So I think your list of what we can do to build a culture that supports curiosity is a fantastic list. And I think it may be very helpful to people who are still teaching in coercive schools, because all of those things are still possible. I wonder if you have any other elements you might add to that list, especially for those people who don't get to teach in an environment of SDE. That's question number one. Question number two is, would you by any chance be offering any classes, experiences, groups for people in that context to learn about facilitating?
Now, that's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about offering groups for people who are still in conventional positions, but I probably should, because I think it's time. I want to close by telling you a quick inspirational story that's just happened now. So somebody bought my book, the How SDE Works and Why, which is just still on ebook, and he sent it to his sister, who is a high school teacher who is very frustrated. And she read the book, at first swearing about me, apparently, because she was like, now I won't be able to just tolerate this environment anymore. But then she started thinking about how to do this. And she has a teen boy in her classes who's hugely disruptive. And she decided to stop trying to control him and start trying to engage with him. So she had some empathic conversations with him. And she found out what his problem is that he thinks the curriculum is really stupid, waste of his time, totally boring, and he hates being forced to be there. So she said, well, what would you study if you could? And he was like, well, I want to design drones. I'd like to learn about robotics, coding, drone design, aerodynamics. And she was like, okay. She went and she looked what she could find online, courses that she felt were within his level of aptitude, because she found out that he actually was pretty good at maths. And she spoke to him and she said, look, how would it be for you if we can persuade everybody to let you do this? And he was like, yes. So she first called in the parents and she said to them, look, your son is going to flunk and fail out, and he's disruptive, and he's probably going to get expelled soon, but he's really keen to do this. I'd be happy for him to have a computer in the corner of the room doing these courses, and I would help him with the difficult bits if you guys give consent and you can persuade the principal. The parents went to the principal. The principal was like, oh, please God, this boy stops being such a problem. And this kid is now sitting in the back of the classroom with a computer studying his own stuff. So, may that, hallelujah, more of that. So since that was recorded, I've been taking a careful look at my course outlines, and I've decided that Sid is so right. It is time. Very next course that I'm going to run is going to start on the 1st of August, 2021. It's going to be a Sunday at 6 p.m. South African time, which is 12 noon Eastern time in the US and 4 p.m. in UCT. So this course is going to be looking at, if you are intrigued by SDE, if you are inspired, you want to do this, but you don't know how to get there from where you are now. How can you start taking the steps in the direction that you want to go? This is going to be for you. It's going to run for 3 months. It's going to have calls on Sundays. It's going to be supported by other links and exercises and readings that you can do in between. Lots of live interaction, lots of real troubleshooting and really tackling your own personal questions around how you want to do this and how you can go about it. I'm going to be doing a free info session the night before on Saturday, the 31st of July at the same time. But I'll also be sending out information on email in advance. So the best thing to do is to sign up using the link down in the description. Sign up for the mailing list. Let me know that you're interested in this specifically. I'll make sure you get all the info for the last minute free event, and then also for the course sign up in case you don't want to leave it until the last minute. My free events, I always make sure to include lots of useful information in the event itself, but it will also help you decide, make that final decision if you're not quite sure whether this course is going to be for you. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you there. Let's open the way to the beautiful educational world that our hearts know is possible.